Welcome to the Security Nexus Deep Dive. We're a Maryland-based national security consultancy that specializes in strategic advisory, education, and public engagement. Really, our whole mission is to inform and empower people by making this complex world of strategic security a little more accessible. And today, we are definitely digging into a fascinating puzzle that's come out of the war in Ukraine.
We're going to be tackling what's called the Troika Problem. It's all about the intense and, as we'll see, maybe intentional, rivalry happening inside Russia's powerful intelligence services.
Because, when you look at the absolutely catastrophic intelligence failures that kicked off the 2022 invasion, you have to ask yourself, is Russia's intelligence system just fundamentally broken? Or is it, paradoxically, working exactly the way its master designed it to?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll paint a picture of just how bad that initial intelligence failure was. Then we'll meet the Troika, the three rival agencies at the very heart of this system. From there, we'll dig into why this whole thing seems designed for division, see how that led to chaos on the battlefield, and really get into this core tension known as the autocrat's paradox. And finally, we'll look at how a system this flawed might actually be exploited.
The intelligence failure before the 2022 invasion is probably going to be studied for decades, right alongside infamous cases like Pearl Harbor or Operation Barbarossa. It was, by almost every measure, just a catastrophic failure on a truly historic scale, and it was all built on some really, really bad assumptions.
The Kremlin was just completely blindsided. Their intelligence told them this would be a quick, clean victory. Instead, they ran headfirst into fierce Ukrainian resistance and the totally unshakable leadership of President Zelensky. They completely misread how fast and how hard Western sanctions would hit. They underestimated the weapons the West would provide. And they even found themselves kind of lonely without the full support of their typical allies. Every single one of these points was a massive intelligence failure.
So who exactly is to blame for getting it all so wrong? Well, to understand that, you have to meet the three-headed beast of Russian intelligence, what we call the Troika.
Okay, now what's really fascinating here is the structure. You've got the FSB, which is the main successor to the old KGB. They handle domestic security, but also, and this is critical, operations in former Soviet states. Then you have the SVR, which is your more traditional foreign intelligence service, and the GRU, which is military intelligence. The key thing to see here is the overlap. But think about this, assigning a whole foreign country like Ukraine to your domestic security service. That tells you everything you need to know. It shows a core belief in the Kremlin that Ukraine isn't a real sovereign state.
Now, traditionally, Russia has made a distinction between razvedka, that's your classic James Bond-style foreign spying, the job of the SVR and GRU, and state security, which is the FSB's job of crushing dissent at home. But under Putin, those lines have just been completely erased. As many sources point out, everything has become an issue of state security now. All three agencies are tangled up in political intelligence, covert active measures, and even assassinations on foreign soil.
And this gets us right to the main argument of this whole explainer. This messy, overlapping, super competitive system, it's not an accident. This fragmentation is a feature, not a bug.
So the thinking goes something like this. Putin intentionally uses a divide and rule strategy. It's classic coup-proofing. By making his intelligence services compete with each other, he guarantees that no single agency can ever get powerful enough to challenge his authority. They don't report to each other. They all report directly to him, fighting for his approval. And this creates a system where loyalty, telling the boss exactly what he wants to hear, is way more valuable than professionalism and cold, hard, objective analysis.
And this just perfectly illustrates the kind of culture that creates. The historian Donald Rayfield put it so bluntly, saying, "The government's just the uniformed version of the mafia." This kind of environment doesn't just breed rivalry, it leads to massive systemic corruption. The agencies have deep links to organized crime, which gives everyone a chance to get rich. And it ensures the security elites, the siloviki, stay loyal because they're profiting from the system.
So, how does a system that's so perfectly designed for internal control lead to such an absolute disaster on the battlefield?
Well, the fallout was immediate, and it was global. In just the months after the invasion, something like 600 Russian intelligence officers, from the SVR and GRU mostly, who were operating under diplomatic cover, got expelled from countries all around the world. In one fell swoop, Russia's human intelligence networks abroad were just decimated. A crippling blow that came directly from their own strategic miscalculation.
And we have this incredible insight supposedly from an FSB leaker who wrote that any analysis is just adjusted to fit the result desired by management because, as he put it, loyalty is valued above professionalism. As analysts like Hugh Dillon, David Geo, and Michael Grossfeld argue, this creates a system that actively punishes bad news. It's institutionalized confirmation bias, from the top all the way down.
And you can literally see how this strategic rot just cascaded down into tactical blunders. Before the war, the FSB spent a fortune building a pro-Russian network in Ukraine that, it turns out, just didn't exist. The money was likely stolen. That led directly to the flawed invasion plan. On the ground, you had Russian troops using unencrypted cell phones and getting ambushed. And then, almost 2 months in, they still underestimated Ukraine and lost the flagship of their Black Sea fleet, the Moskva.
This whole cascade of failure really exposes the core tension in Putin's system, something scholars call the autocrat's paradox. At its heart, it's a direct trade-off. You are prioritizing the survival of the regime over actual success on the battlefield.
As analysts like Hugh Dillon and David Geo have laid out, the very things that make the system great for regime security make it absolutely terrible for fighting a war. Coup-proofing and competition, that destroys coordination. Rewarding loyalty and flattery, that kills objective analysis. Suppressing dissent and bad news, that ensures the leader is completely flying blind.
In short, as the author Brian Klaas puts it, Putin has fallen into the dictator trap. The very strategies he used to get and keep absolute power, isolating himself, demanding loyalty, punishing the truth, are the same things that led him straight into this massive strategic blunder. His own system prevented him from getting the intelligence he actually needed.
Okay, so what does all this mean for the West and for Ukraine? If this dysfunctional system is actually working as intended, how can you possibly counter it?
Well, the system's flaws create some very clear vulnerabilities. All that corruption, it opens the door for recruiting spies. The intense rivalry, it means the agencies don't share information, which makes them perfect targets for deception campaigns. And if you can expose the rampant embezzlement, you can sow even more distrust and paranoia inside the system.
But, and this is a really crucial point, while these services failed spectacularly at preparing for war, they have been ruthlessly, brutally effective in their primary mission, protecting the regime. Since the invasion started, they have tightened their grip on Russian society, crushing any dissent to make sure Putin's power remains absolute.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty heavy question. If all these failures are an acceptable price to pay for regime stability, if they're a feature, not a bug, then how does Western strategy need to adapt to deal with a state that deliberately chooses its own internal security over external competence?
It is a really complex challenge, and there are definitely no easy answers. For more deep dives like this one on other critical national security topics, please be sure to visit us at thesecuritynexus.net.